well today we've got Eli James. I've talked about it before, Anglo-Saxon-Israel.com, and he's going to talk on who the modern day Israelites are, or the Jews, if you kind of distinguish between the two. And so I'll bring him up. Come on up.
Okay. Thank you, David. As David was saying, my website is www.anglo-saxonisrael.com, and on that website there are many articles and videos referencing the Israelite people and the Jewish people and the distinctions between them. Now, of course, the vast majority of people today believe that Israel and the Jews are the same people, and that has never been true. That is, in fact, one of the biggest lies of history, namely the Jewish claim that they are the Israel of the Bible. In fact, we'll be referencing many quotations from Scripture, such as Revelation 2:9, Revelation 3:9, and 12:9, all of which tell us, for example, Revelation 2:9 says that there is a people who say they are Jews, are not, and do lie, but are the synagogue of Satan. And so we have to understand that there's great deception, monumental deception that has been taking place in the last 2,000 years, and we can say very specifically in the last 2,125 years, that a group of people who are non-Israelites, in fact, are Edomites and Canaanites, who have been masquerading, who have been pretending to be Israel for the last 2 millennia. And it's because of this extensive deception, this extensively long period of time, during which these Edomite Jews, and we'll be talking about the Edomite Jews throughout most of this video, that these Edomite Jews have been pretending to be Israel by, number one, adopting the culture, some aspects of the culture of ancient Israel and the house of Judah, and also by having claimed to author the Old Testament. The Old Testament, of course, was written by Hebrews, by Judahites primarily, although other members of other tribes were involved in that as well. But I can say categorically that not a single word of the Bible was written by a Jew. And that's because the Jews aren't Israelites and never were Israelites. In fact, the Sephardic Jews, as we're going to find out today, were actually members of the Canaanite Edomite tribe of Idumea, and related peoples who were always at war with Israel. And we're going to be quoting prophecies from the Old Testament that state that the Edomites would one day covet the name of Israel and covet their land and take it over. And those are historical facts that occurred just before the days of Christ. The Edomites did take over. They usurped the throne of Judah, and the man who did that was Herod, known as Herod the Great. And he was actually installed by his father Antipater and Julius Caesar. It was a coup. It was a usurpation of the kingdom of Judah. And that explains why Herod was so anxious to kill baby Jesus, because Herod, being an Edomite, knew very well that Jesus was the true heir to the throne of Judah, and that's why the Judahites were hated by the Edomites at this. And these Edomites knew that they were culturally different from the Israelites of the house of Judah in Judea in those days. In fact, the Judahite women protested on virtually a daily basis against King Herod, because they said, hey, Herod, he's not one of us, he's not a Judahite, he's an Edomite. And this aspect of the history of Judea during the intertestamental period and leading up to the days of Christ is utterly ignored by virtually all historians who are, and all biblical theologians, who are simply either unaware of the actual history of these days, or who are actually covering up for the synagogue of Satan. So the major thrust of this video is going to be about the Edomite Jews, those Jews who lived side by side with the Israelites throughout biblical history. And we can demonstrate that these are two separate groups of people, two lines of descent. The Bible makes it very clear that there are two lines of descent and also continuous enemies throughout the existence of both lines of descent. And that continues even down to this day, as we will show. But before we get into the subject of the Edomites, we have to clear up one thing. In Christian identity, such pastors as Dr. Wesley Swift and Bertrand Comparet have been saying for decades that the Jewish people are not the Israel of the Bible. They're not the Israel of God. They're not the Israel of Yahweh. And that there are two distinct groups of people blended into one people, namely the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews. And typically, if you ask a Jew, well, what's the difference between a Sephardic Jew and an Ashkenazi Jew? They say, well, the Ashkenazis are European Jews, and the Sephardic Jews are Spanish Jews. But that doesn't explain where they came from, okay? To say that the Sephardic Jews came from Spain is not to explain where the Spanish Jews themselves came from. Well, we know they came from the Middle East. They came from the Middle East, they came from Palestine, many of whom wandered across northern Africa and actually were in cahoots with the Moors against the Christians of Spain, and were instigating the Moors to attack Christian Spain. So those Spanish Jews were actually the Sephardic Jews who came from the Middle East, who were actually the survivors of the Roman army's destruction of Jerusalem and the army under Titus, the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem, and many of the the wars that the Jews fought were against the Romans. So it was the Romans who destroyed the temple and burned it to the ground, and basically spread the Jewish people from there far and wide. Okay, so that's the Jewish diaspora, or dispersion, as they call it, a diaspora. But we know, and I want to refer you to other of our videos, the Migration of Israel videos, which prove that the 10 northern tribes, with large numbers of the 2 southern tribes, that is Judah and Benjamin, which accompanied them into Europe, became known as the Caucasian people, and the Caucasian people are all descended from the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's covered in other videos on this website and on anglo-saxonisrael.com. So today, in this section, in this very first introduction, we're going to be talking about the Ashkenazim primarily and who they are. And I'm going to make some quotes here from Jews and from historians who tell us who these Ashkenazim really are. And they're not Israel. I can say categorically, without fear of contradiction, that the Ashkenazi Jews have no Israelite blood, no Judahite blood, no Hebrew blood, no Shemitic blood. That's right. The Ashkenazi Jews, who are up to 95% of the Jewish population in the world today, do not have a single drop of Shemitic blood in them. The fact is, most Ashkenazim are descended from 3 genomes, from the Japhethites. Japheth was the brother of Shem, so a Japhethite cannot be a Shemite. And the Mongols and the Turks, who were part of the, I should put it this way, the Hittite kingdom that migrated north, who were absorbed by the Turkish Empire in early times. Okay, so we have the Japhethites, the Mongols, and the Hittites, also known as Turks. Those 3 genomes make up the Ashkenazi people, and there's no Shemitic blood in those people whatsoever. And I'm going to quote from Jewish authors and other historians that this is indeed a fact. For example, this in Titus, let's start with the Bible. Titus 1, verses 13 through 15. This witness is true, wherefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith. And of course he's talking about the Israelites, because the entire Bible is written to Israel. It's not written to the Jews or to any other people. Not giving heed to Jewish fables So we're not to believe Jewish fables and commandments of men, which is a direct reference to the Pharisees who made up their own commandments in opposition to the laws of Yahweh, the law of God, that turn from the truth. Unto the pure all things are pure, but unto them that are defiled, and he's referring to the Pharisees here, and unbelieving is nothing pure, but even their mind and conscience is defiled. So this is what Paul is saying about these Pharisees who invented the religion called Judaism. And we'll bring this out later on, that Judaism is not the religion of the Old Testament. Judaism is actually a recently invented religion just before the days of Christ. And this is what Paul is trying to tell us, that these people have a defiled conscience and that their traditions are the traditions of men, they're not the traditions of the Bible. Okay? In his book, The Outline of History, H.G. Wells tells us, quote, "It is highly probable that the bulk of the Jews' ancestors never lived in Palestine at all, which witnesses the power of historical assertion over fact." What is H.G. Wells trying to tell us? Well, what I just explained, that the Jewish people, the Ashkenazi Jews, none of their ancestors ever lived in Palestine. None of their ancestors are Hebrews, Shemites, Judahites, or Israelites. They are completely different people who adopted the religion of Judaism around 740 AD. But to convert to a religion does not convert your genetics or your DNA from one group to another. People, Judeo-Christians ask me, well, what difference does all this make? What difference does it make if the Jewish people aren't really Israel at all? Well, the fact is that the Jewish claim to the land of Palestine and the genocidal tactics that they're using against the Palestinian people and the wars they're making in the Middle East based on their claim to the territory from the river of Egypt to the Tigris and Euphrates, namely Eretz Israel, as the Jews call it, it's a fraud. Since those people are not even Israelites, what they're doing in the Middle East is totally illegitimate. It's part of the great deception that we find in Revelation 12:9, which tells us that there is a beast that will deceive the whole world. Now, I have never found a Judeo-Christian minister to even address that verse as to who it might be or what it might be that's deceiving the entire world. Well, if the Jews are claiming to be Israel and they're not, well, they're deceiving the entire world with that lie. From Missing Links Discovered in Assyrian Tablets, a book by E. Raymond Capt, he says, "A great majority of the Jews today are Semites only in speech," which means that the fact that they still speak Hebrew, that some of them speak Hebrew, which is, even that is only a modern version of ancient Hebrew. The Bible is written in Paleo-Hebrew, and the modern Jewish version of it is completely different, and it's hard to say whether they're actually pronouncing the words correctly or putting their sentences correctly together. It's modern Hebrew. It's not the same as the Hebrew that was employed to write the Bible. Okay, now Professor A.N. Poliak of Tel Aviv University has this to say. This would mean, since the Ashkenazi people are not Israelites, this would mean that their ancestors came not from the Jordan, but from the Volga. Not from Canaan, but from the Caucasus, because they occupied southern Russia in 740 AD when they converted to Judaism. Once believed to be the cradle of the Aryan race, well, it was earlier the cradle of the Aryan race, and that genetically they are more related to the Hun, Uyghur, and Magyar tribes than to the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let me repeat this. If all of this stuff about the Ashkenazi Jews is true, and it is, this would mean that their ancestors came not from the Jordan, but from the Caucasus, from the Volga, and that genetically they are more related to the Hun, Uyghur, and Magyar tribes than to the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Again, this is Professor A.N. Poliak Tel Aviv University. I'd like to point out a book that has created a sensation in the Jewish world, and I'm not so sure that the Judeo-Christian world has taken notice of it. They probably haven't because, as I said, they don't seem to care who is posing as Israel and who really is Israel. But Shlomo Sand, The Invention of the Jewish People. This book, and there's other books that have been written like this lately, that talk about the fact that the Ashkenazi people are not Israelites at all, that their origin is in a non-Israelite people in southern, southeastern Europe, the steppes of Central Asia, from Eastern Europe into Western Asia. That's where they actually originate from. Tex Mars, in his newsletter, The Power of Prophecy, talks about, this is the April 2013 issue, talks about the study that was done in Johns Hopkins University that showed that the DNA of the Jewish people is not the same as the DNA of the Israelite people. Okay? Let me quote here. This is the headline. DNA science confounds the common wisdom. There's only one problem for the Jews here, and it is a huge one. Science proves that those who call themselves Jews are not Jews, or not Judaites, or Israelites is the proper way to say this. DNA science has confounded the Christian evangelicals by proving conclusively that most of the people in the nation of Israel and in world Jewry are not the descendants of Abraham. Those living today who profess to be Jews are not of the ancient Israelites, and they are not the seed of Abraham. In fact, the new DNA research shows that the Palestinians actually have more Israelite blood than the Jews. The nation of Israel today is populated with 7.5 million imposters. I couldn't have said it better myself. Next headline. The Jews are not Jews, but are Khazarians. All right, the Jews are not Judaites, is the correct way to say this, but are Khazarians. The newest DNA science finding is from Dr. Aaron El-Hayek, who is a Jew, and associates at the McKusick-Nathans Institute of Genetic Medicine, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, in research accepted December 5, 2012, and published by the Oxford University Press on behalf of the Society of Molecular Biology and Evolution. It was found that the Khazarian hypothesis is scientifically correct. What does that mean? Simply stated, it holds that the Jewry genome, that is their genetic code, is a mosaic of ancestries which rise primarily out of the Khazars. Jews are Khazars, not Israelites. Next paragraph. The Jews of America, Europe, and Israel are descendants not of Father Abraham, but of King Bulan and the people of ancient Khazaria. Khazaria was an amalgam of Turkic clans who once lived in the Caucasus, or that is southern Russia, in the early centuries of the Christian era. These Turkic peoples were pagans who converted to Judaism in the 8th century. As converts, they called themselves Jews, but none of their blood comes from Israel. Let me repeat this last sentence. None of their blood comes from Israel. So, what difference does it make if these modern-day Jews are Israel or not? Well, if they're not Israel, they have no claim to Palestine. It's just that simple. The entire operation, that is the so-called return of the Jews to Palestine, is a patently obvious fraud if they are not the Israel of the Bible. Alfred Lilienthal, in his book, The Zionist Connection 2, puts it this way. And without the hue and cry, namely anti-Semitism, because the Jews always cry anti-Semitism if you criticize any aspect of their theology and propaganda. Without the hue and cry of anti-Semitism, pray what happens to the Zionist movement. In other words, if you criticize them, they shout you down with insults and call you an anti-Semite when they themselves are not even Semites. The Khazar conversion was not unique. Who can say for sure that many Christian readers of this book might not in fact have a better claim which they do not choose to exercise, to go back home to Palestine than Hanish Shimmer, Menachem Begin, or Golda Meir. So Mr. Lilienthal is actually conceding that we Caucasians have a better claim to Palestine than the Jews do. The Jewish Encyclopedia tells us this. This is the 1925 edition, volume 54, page 41. Edom is in modern Jewry. What does that mean? Well, it tells us that the Jews know that in addition to Ashkenazi blood, they have Edomite blood flowing through their veins. And that's going to be the major subject of this video series here. And Luke 12:1, which tells us, beware the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Because Judaism is the religion of the Pharisees. It's not the religion of Moses. It's a complete fraud having nothing to do with the religion of Moses. Although the Jewish Pharisees, that is today's rabbis, claim that their religion is based on the laws of Moses, but they do not obey the laws of Moses. They break the laws of Moses constantly while pretending to obey them. So, let me quote a couple more scholars. This is Rabbi Ben Zion Boxer, B-O-K-S-E-R, in his book, Judaism and the Christian Predicament. He says this: this is not an uncommon impression, and one finds it sometimes among Jews as well as Christians, that Judaism is the religion of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, this is a very common impression. That's what most people believe, right? Remember, Revelation 12:9 says the beast will deceive the whole world. Everybody believes this, except those of us in Christian identity. We know better. He says, it is, of course, a fallacious impression. And he states this offhandedly as if everybody knows it. It is, of course, he says, a fallacious impression. Judaism is not the religion of the Bible. Let me repeat that. Judaism is not the religion of the Bible. Well, if it's not the religion of the Bible, whose religion is it? Well, the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia tells us whose religion it is. Quote, the Jewish religion as it is today traces its descent without a break through all the centuries from the Pharisees. Their leading ideas and methods found expression in a literature of enormous extent, of which a very great deal is still in existence. The Talmud is the largest and most important single member of that literature. So, not only are the Jewish people a fraud when they claim to be Israel, but their whole religion is a fraud when they claim that it is based on the laws of Moses, which it is not. It is based on the commentaries of the rabbis who composed the Talmud over the last 2,000 years. But that composition was already an oral tradition in the days of Christ, where Jesus Christ himself told the Pharisees, quote, you have made the law of none effect by your traditions. He also said, that's Matthew chapter 15, verse 5. He also said, if you had believed Moses, you would believe me. So it's very obvious that Jesus Christ understood that these Jews, these rabbis, the authors of the religion of Judaism, were preaching a new religion, completely new religion, using the Old Testament as a, how should I put it, a false reference, because they only pretend to obey the Torah while they actually practice the Talmud. So there's a big difference between practicing the laws of Moses and practicing your own traditions while going around, running around the world claiming that you're actually obeying Moses when you are not. Rabbi Moshe M. Magal, President, National Jewish Information Service, in a letter dated 21st August 1961, says this: you will notice the great difference between the Jewish and Christian religions. But these are not all. We consider the two religions so different that one excludes the other. One excludes the other. There is no such thing as Judeo-Christianity. That's just another part of the gigantic fraud of Judaism today, pretending that there's some similarity between the two religions. You can't deny Christ and accept Him at the same time. Jesus said, you're either for me or against me. And if you're against Him, you cannot have a Judeo against Christian for religion. You can't be for Him and against Him at the same time. So if you're a Judeo-Christian, you are very confused. You're a very confused person. And you need to get rid of that Judeo label entirely. We emphasize, quote, that there is no such thing as a Judeo-Christian religion. There is not any similarity between the two concepts. Again, Rabbi Moshe M. Magal, president of the National Jewish Information Service. From the 1980 Jewish Almanac, an article entitled A Brief History of the Terms for Jew says this, quote, strictly speaking, it is incorrect to call an ancient Israelite a Jew, or to call a contemporary Jew an Israelite or a Hebrew. Pure admission of the fact that the Jewish people, as we know them today, are not Israelites or Hebrews. A Jew is not an Israelite or a Hebrew. So why is it that the entire world believes the opposite? It's because Talmudism, which is the Jewish religion, has been deceiving the entire world for the last 2100 years. So what are we going to do about this situation? The truth has to come out. The world has to understand who the Jews really are. And we just went through proofs, many by Jewish authors themselves, admitting that the Jewish people are not the Israel of the Old Testament. They're not Hebrews. They're not Shemites. They are imposters. That's the fact of the matter. And in Revelation chapter 2, I'm going to quote Revelation chapter 2, verse 9. And he's speaking to Israel here, because the entire book of the Bible is written to the Israelites, not to the Jews. Verse 9, I know thy works and tribulation, he's speaking to Israel, and poverty. But thou art rich, because we have a rich heritage as Israel. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews, and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. So those impostors who claim to be the Judahites and the Judeans of early Christian times, we are being told, remember, this is Jesus Christ dictating these words to John the Apostle, says, no, these Jews are impostors, and they are really the synagogue of Satan. Chapter 3, verse 9, behold, I will make them the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews, and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee. So in other words, he loves Israel, but the Jews, the synagogue of Satan, he will force them at some future point, because this is prophecy, to worship at our feet. In other words, the Jews will at some future date, and I think this is going to happen very quickly, that they will admit that we Caucasian Israelites are the true Israelites of the world, and that they are imposters. Because at the second coming, Jesus Christ is going to judge them as tares in Matthew chapter 13. And we'll get to that toward the end of this series. Revelation chapter 12, verse 9. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So who was cast out of heaven? Lucifer. Lucifer was cast out of heaven, and his followers today are led by the rabbis of Judaism, because they are the authors of the greatest deceit in history. Not just historical deceit, economic deceit, religious deceit, media deceit. They control the media, which lies to us constantly about that Israeli state being peopled or populated by Israel, when in fact they are Ashkenazis and Sephardim. So I think we've answered the question, who are the Ashkenazi Jews? We're talking about up to 95% of the world's Jews today are Ashkenazi Jews, none of whom have a single ancestor in ancient Israel, none of them have a single Shemitic ancestor, none of them have a single Hebrew ancestor. They are a completely different group of people, as I pointed out. And Arthur Kessler, in his book, The 13th Tribe, goes into great detail as to their true ancestry, which is not biblical Hebrew ancestry at all. And I advise you, if you really want to study this subject, get that book, Arthur Kessler's The 13th Tribe, because that is the most detailed book on the subject. And although Shlomo Sand's material relatively well updates the material in Arthur Kessler's book. Okay? So, who are the Jewish people? Can the Jewish people make any legitimate claim to being the Israel of the Bible? Well, we've ruled out up to 95% of the Jews today. They have absolutely no claim to that land called Palestine. No Ashkenazi Jew can claim to have Israelite heritage. So they cannot say, we went to Palestine to reclaim our territory, to reclaim our country, to reclaim our land. They cannot say that because that's a lie. It is simply a lie. So, what's left? Who's left of the Jewish people? Well, it's the Sephardic Jews. Who are the Sephardic Jews? Well, their answer is, well, the Sephardic Jews are the Spanish Jews, or you could say Western Jews, the Jews of Western Europe. But those people did not arrive in Spain until around 800 AD with the Moors. They had to have lived somewhere else before then. And the reason why the Sephardic Jews give that brief, deceptive answer is because they don't want you to know that they're the descendants of the Sepharvaim of the Old Testament. And who are the Sepharvaim? They were a Canaanite tribe that originated in the vicinity of ancient Babylon. And that's why the Babylonian Talmud is called Babylonian, is because that priesthood is using Babylonian teaching, not Mosaic teaching, not Hebrew teaching. They're using Babylonian teaching. And once you understand these facts, as will be detailed after part 1, the introductory part that we're doing right here, as we get into greater and greater detail as to who these Sephardic Jews really are, and their origin not only in the Babylonian Canaanites, but in the Canaanites of ancient Canaan land, which the Israelites were told by Yahweh were their perpetual enemy. So the people today from the Middle East who call themselves Sephardic Jews are actually the enemies of ancient Israel, and they have not ceased to be the enemy of ancient Israel, because we, the Caucasian people, are the descendants of ancient Israel, and the Jews are the descendants of the Canaanites and Edomites of the Bible, as we're going to be demonstrating from this point on. Welcome back to our series. This is part 2 of who are the modern day Jews, and in part 1 I just want to do a quick recap of the fact that we proved conclusively from Jewish sources and from scholarly sources, and even from scientific sources, DNA studies, that the Khazar Jews, namely the Ashkenazi Jews, have nothing to do either historically, genetically, culturally, socially, or any other way with the actual Israelites of the Bible. They were converted to Judaism in the year 740 AD, and they were never an Israelite people whatsoever. As H.G. Wells said in his Outline of History, the bulk of the Jews never set foot in Palestine, because their history is totally separate and distinct. And I just want to reference a few books. This is Arthur Kessler, The 13th Tribe. Arthur Koestler is a Jewish author, very well-known best-selling author, who wrote this book, The 13th Tribe, explaining the history of the Khazars and the fact that the bulk of the Jewish people are Khazars and not Israelites. We have here also The History of the Jewish Khazars by Dunlop. Princeton, New Jersey, 1954, who does an outstanding job of talking about the subject too. We have The Synagogue of Satan by Andrew Carrington Hitchcock, which is available online. It's a best-selling book from Britain. Also talks about, especially about the Rothschilds, the history of the Rothschilds, and how the Rothschilds are the leading Ashkenazi Jews who actually financed the Zionist movement and created this false idea that these Ashkenazis are in fact the Israelites of the Bible. So there's a tremendous amount of history on this. Of course, none of this is taught in the Judeo-Christian churches, and certainly the rabbis of Judaism did not teach this either, because they don't want the world to know that Judaism is a complete and total fraud. We also have here By Way of Deception by Victor Ostrovsky, who is an Israeli citizen who was a former Mossad officer, explaining how Judaism and everything the Israelis do is nothing but deceit. The motto of the Mossad is, by deception, make war. So why all this deception? Why all this deception? The Jews live by deception, as we've been trying to explain to you. And everything about Judaism is deception, and everything about the Jewish claim to being Israel is deception. So now we're going to turn to our second part of this series, the origin of the Sephardic Jews. Who are the Sephardic Jews? We also call them the Edomite Jews. And we'll explain why we refer to them as Edomite Jews. And so I'm going to start by referencing an article on my website, www.anglo-saxonisrael.com, and the title of this article is Explaining Identity, Christian Identity, to White Nationalists and Neo-Pagans. And the reason why I wrote this article is because a lot of white nationalists and pagan whites who have migrated away from Christianity and migrated away from mainstream white Christian civilization is because they falsely believe that the Jews are the Israel of the Bible. They believe that Jesus was a Jew, which is another lie, and consequently they reject Judeo-Christianity wholesale because they believe it's Jewish. Now, to some extent it is Jewish, but only in modern times. You have to remember that not until the early 20th century was this concept of Judeo-Christianity prevalent. That concept actually developed in the 20th century. Previous to the 20th century, Christians and Jews never had anything to do with one another. Christians universally condemned the Jews as the children of Satan, as the followers of the religion of the Pharisees, as the Talmudic reprobates that they still are. It's only in the 20th century that this idea that the Jews are the equivalent of Israel, that this idea actually took hold. And so I think the word Judeo-Christian was not coined actually until the 1930s. So there was no such idea in Christianity, such as Judeo-Christianity, until very recently in history. And this is part of the Zionist deceit by which the Zionist Jews fool Christians everywhere, and even neo-pagans, even white nationals and neo-pagans, by claiming to be Israel, which they are not. Okay? So we talked about the Ashkenazim, and I just want to recap a little bit about what we said of the Ashkenazi. In these opening quotations, which we cited in part 1, we cited several scholars who can verify that the Ashkenazi Khazars are not even Shemites, so they cannot possibly be Israelites or Judahites. And remember, this encompasses 95% of Jews in the world today. This simple categorical fact is quite deliberately ignored by everyone on the planet except for those of us in Christian identity. To expose, not even the Arabs are aware of these things, although they are to some extent. Muslims are actually fairly aware of the Ashkenazi pretense of being Israel. To expose the non-Shemitic origin of the Jewish people is to expose the Antichrist. And the devil is furiously militating against this truth coming out. This is why Christian identity is demonized everywhere. This is why the Jews took my website down back in July of 2012, because my website reveals these facts about the Jewish people. All Khazars are of three main genetic strains: Japheth, Hittite, and Mongol. None of these three groups ever set foot in the land of Israel, or Palestine, more properly called, until 1948, when these non-Israelite Khazars invaded that innocent country, pretending to be Israel and or Judah. Yet these non-Shemitic mongrels claim to be Shemites, and to point out that they are imposters makes one an anti-Semite in their view, even though they're not even Shemites themselves. Of course, when dealing with Jewish mythology, all logic is thrown out the window. Thus, the Khazars converted to the religion of Judaism in 740 AD, and the Khazars being non-Israelites. Before that date, there was no such thing as an Ashkenazi Jew. All Jewish historians admit these facts, yet no one raises the issue. If these people aren't even Shemites, how can they claim to have originated in Palestine around 70 AD? Well, they did not. So, in 1966, a Jewish historian attempted to get the Israeli government to recognize Jewry's Khazar ancestry. The government summarily rejected his plans. I'm going to quote now from the article about this person's plans to memorialize the Khazar ancestry of the Jewish people in the Israeli state. This is from the San Diego Union of August 28, 1966. Nathan M. Pollock has a beef with the Israeli government. His elaborate plans to celebrate this September the 1000th anniversary of the Jewish-Khazar alliance were summarily rejected. He has devoted 40 of his 64 years to trying to prove that 6 out of 10 Israelis and 9 out of 10 Jews in the Western Hemisphere are not real Jews, or in other words, not Judahites, but descendants of fierce Khazar tribes which roamed the steppes of southern Russia many centuries ago. For obvious reasons, the Israeli authorities are not at all eager to give official stamp of approval of Pollock's theories. These are the words of Leo Hyman in an article entitled "The Jews That Aren't," San Diego Union, August 28, 1966. Now, it's obvious that the Jewish people are fully aware of the major difference between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. The Jewish people are fully aware that Ashkenazi Jews have no connection whatsoever with the Israelites of the Bible. This article proves it, because the Israeli state had to issue a ruling on this petition by Mr. Pollock. And of course they rejected it because they don't want you Christians to know who they really are. So, who are the Sephardim? So we've dealt with 95% of the Jews today, most of whom, of course, are Ashkenazis. They're not the Israelites of the Bible at all. Have no connection. Not even were they neighbors with the Israelites. They were in a totally different area of the world, north of the Caspian and Black Seas, totally separate from the Israelites of the Bible. So now we're going to talk about the Sephardim, because the question we're asking for this part is, who or what is a Sephardic Jew? Where do the Sephardim come from? This is the name the dispersed Jews chose to retain after their expulsion from Judea by the Romans. These Sephardic Jews, although completely unrelated to true Israel and true Judah, at least have a history of living among the Israelites of the Bible. And we're going to detail that history, but they were never part of either the house of Judah or the house of Israel. They were always a separate people and always the enemies of both the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In fact, David spent much of his time making war against these Edomite Jews, these Edomite Sephardic Jews. To understand what happened in those days, we have to go back to the period when the 10 northern tribes were taken captive by the Assyrians, a period that lasted from 745 BC to about 701 BC. These 10 tribes had been practicing pagan rituals and engaging in illicit sexual practices just like the neighboring Canaanites. And we'll find out that what happened was that the Israelites under Joshua, who were commanded to take over the entire land of Canaan and rid the land of these evil Canaanites, did not do the job. And because they failed to do the job, they allowed a remnant of these Canaanite people to prosper. And these are the people into which Esau, Jacob's brother, married into, thus changing the name of the Canaanites to Edomites. And we'll detail that in very great detail in the next part. So, what we're being told here is the Israelites began worshiping the same gods as these Canaanites and Edomites began to worship. Okay? And had been worshiping in that area for a long, long time. In 2 Kings chapter 17, we're told that after the Israelites of the house of Israel had been removed from Samaria toward Media, Media being north, just below the Caucasus Mountains, the Assyrians then imported the Sepharvaim to live in the vacated territory. The account also tells us that these Sepharvaim later began to practice, quote-unquote, the laws of Moses. But these people were not Israelites. They were Babylonian Canaanites. So this was the first historical instance when a non-Israelite people began to practice a bastardized version of our religion. These, therefore, are the original Sephardic Jews. So the idea of adopting the religion of another people existed at this time. And it came into the minds of these Sephardic Canaanite Jews. And these have been practicing their own version of the religion of Moses ever since. But they never were Israelites. Never. So the origin, and this is why the Babylonian Talmud is called Babylonian. It's because these ideas came from Babylon. I'm going to quote here from the website, the assemblyofTrueIsrael.com/truth page, the word Jew. The Sephardim Jews, or Sepharvaim Jews, are not of Hebrew Israelite blood. They are not of the tribe of Yehuda, that is Judah, although they were called Yehudaim as inhabitants, as persons living in the land originally occupied by Judah and Israel. Okay? But there's a difference between Yehudaim, means simply inhabitant of the land of Judah, versus a Judahite who is an actual blood descendant of Judah himself. Their descent is mixed from Edom, Esau, Canaanite blood. The Sephardim Jews, like the Ashkenazi Khazar Jews, are not a Shemitic people. The word Sephardim is not a Hebrew word for Spain, although the name has become associated with Spain because many Sephardim Jews organized as a people group in Spain. So, and here is when you ask a Sephardic Jew, well, what is a Sephardic Jew? They tell you it's a Spanish Jew. But that does not tell us where they came from, because obviously Jews claim descent from Israel, so they had to have originated in Israel by their own account. But they're afraid that you might find out what the word Sepharvaim really means. So I'm going to quote from Strong's Concordance. And here is the definition given in Strong's Concordance for the term Sepharvaim. And they define it as, quote, a place in Assyria, Sepharvaim. Now, this place in Assyria was taken over by the Assyrians after they conquered Babylonian territory. And other authors tell us that Sepharvaim was a province of Babylon. It was a province to the west of Babylon, between Babylon and Canaan land. So the origin of these people is Babylonian, and it's not Israelite. It's not Hebrew, it's not Judahite, and it's not Shemitic. So, as we found out about the Ashkenazi Jews, they are of non-Shemitic origin, and now we're finding out the Sephardic Jews are of non-Shemitic origin as well. So we can see the entire facade, charade, impersonation by the Jewish people as Israel is history's oldest and greatest hoax. It's nothing but a hoax, and it's because these Sephardic Jews began to impersonate Israel. And they learned how to do this in 2 Kings chapter 17. And here is what happened. This is what the Bible tells us about this era. Verse 1. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, began Hoshea, the son of Elah, to reign in Samaria over Israel 9 years. This is after the breakup of the 12 tribes into 2 houses. And this is another story that neither the Jews nor the Judeo-Christian ministry wants you to know about. The fact is that the 12 tribes broke up into 2 houses. The house of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, the house of Judah, the 2 southern tribes. These 2 houses frequently made war against each other. And they made allies with other nations. They're fighting in wars against each other. So the house of Israel and the house of Judah, although consisting of Israelite tribes, had become enemies. And this was right after the days of Solomon. And we're going to quote Nehemiah chapter 13 as to what provoked these wars between the northern house of Israel and the southern house of Judah. So, verse 2, and Hosea did that which was evil in the sight of Yahweh, but not as the kings of Israel that were before him. Now, what kind of evil did this new king of Israel do? Verse 3. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents. All right, so the 10 northern tribes, the house of Israel, became tributaries to the Assyrians. And why? Well, because they were worshiping Canaanite gods and goddesses. They were offending Yahweh horribly by doing these things, as is explained herein. And the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no present to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land, and went to Samaria, and besieged it 3 years. The 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria, and carried Israel away into Assyria, and placed them in Halah and Habor by the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So this is telling us a story that the 10 northern tribes were taken captive and relocated just south of the Caucasus Mountains. And on my website, www.anglo-saxonisrael.com, the Migration Chronicles slideshow picks up this story and shows how our ancestors, the Israelites, migrated across the Caucasus Mountains, and our ancestors appeared there right after these deportations. Verse 7, for so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their God, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the statutes of the heathen, whom Yahweh had cast out from before the children of Israel, of the kings of Israel, which they had made. So in other words, Yahweh had instructed our people to destroy the Canaanitish people and their gods, but instead what happened was the 10 northern tribes began adopting Canaanite religion. And they walked in the statutes of the heathen, whom Yahweh had cast out from before the children of Israel. And the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against Yahweh their Elohim, and they built them high places in all their cities, from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city. So in other words, not only were the Israelites following Canaanite religion, they built their own Canaanite monuments. And they set themselves up images and groves in every high hill and under every green tree. In other words, our Israelite ancestors had become paganized. And there they burnt incense in all the high places, as did the heathen, whom Yahweh carried away before them. So in other words, Yahweh gave us the power to destroy these people, but because we didn't complete the job, we began to be like them, as modern Judeo-Christianity has become like the heathen nations. No, we are no longer a separate people. If you're in a Judeo-Christian church, you're actually practicing heathen religion, whether you know it or not. For they served idols, whereof Yahweh had said unto them, Ye shall not do this thing. Yet Yahweh testified against Israel and against Judah by all the prophets and by all the seers, saying, Turn ye from your evil ways, and keep my commandments and my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you by my servants the prophets. But of course, our people did not obey his commandments. Notwithstanding, they would not hear, but hardened their necks like to the neck of their fathers, that did not believe in Yahweh their God. And they rejected his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers, and his testimonies which he testified against them. And they followed vanity, and became vain, and went after the heathen that were round about them, concerning whom Yahweh had charged them that they should not do like them. We can see, folks, that Judeo-Christianity has also become heathenized, because our so-called Christian churches are now accepting Wiccans and homosexuals and Jews and every kind of abomination under the sun. Children out of wedlock, marriage has gone to hell under these modern churches, because they have become heathenized. In attempting to bring more people into the churches, they pervert the religion and expand it to bring more heathen in. And that's why modern Judeo-Christianity, being a 501c3 Jewish entity, no longer teaches Yahweh's laws. That's why these churches tell you that the law has been done away with. Well, they have done away with the law, but Yahweh's laws are forever. They rejected his statutes and his covenants, and they left all the commandments of Yahweh their God, and made them molten images, even 2 calves, just like in the desert, right, at Sinai, and made a grove, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. And they caused their sons and their daughters, now listen to this, to pass through the fire, and used divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of Yahweh, to provoke him to anger. What does this mean? It means they took their newborn infant babies and threw them into the fires of Moloch as a sacrifice to this pagan god. This is what they did, folks. I think abortion today counts as a similar type of sacrifice to the pagan god Moloch. Therefore Yahweh was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only. And Judah, of course, had the city of Jerusalem, the well-defended city of Jerusalem. And since they did not actually build groves and build images to the gods of the Canaanites, they were not likewise judged. But they had their own judgment coming a little later, when they were banished to Babylon for 70 years. Now, verse 19. Also Judah kept not the commandments of Yahweh their God, but walked in the statutes of Israel which they had made. And Yahweh rejected all the seed of Israel, and afflicted them, and delivered them into the hand of spoilers, until he had cast them out of his sight. Of course, this casting away is only temporary, because he says very clearly, I will bring you back. I will bring you back, Israel. Verse 21. For he rent Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And Jeroboam drave Israel from following the Lord, that is Yahweh, and made them sin a great sin. For the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. He was the king of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. They departed not from them, until Yahweh removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by all his servants the prophets. So was Israel carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. In the writing of the books of 2 Kings here. Verse 24. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cutha, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim. He brought people from Sepharvaim. Remember what Sepharvaim is? It's a province of Babylon, which was later defeated by the Assyrians, and that's why Strong's Concordance defines it as a province of Assyria. And placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. So what happened was, once the Israelites were removed from Samaria, the king of Assyria brought in all these foreigners from different nations, from different lands, to work the land, to be the farmers and the goat herders, etc., to provide tribute to the king of Assyria. But these Israelites were all deported. The 10 northern tribes were all deported, with the exception of a few people. And so it was at the beginning of their dwelling there. We're talking about these Sepharvaim and other non-Israelite people. They feared not Yahweh. Therefore Yahweh sent lions among them, which slew some of them. Wherefore they spake to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations which thou hast removed, and placed in the cities of Samaria, know not the manner of the God of the land. Therefore he hath sent lions among them, and behold, they slay them, because they know not the manner of the God of the land. Now, of course, in these days, the heathen believed in local gods. They had a pantheon of all different kinds of gods, weather gods, fertility gods, etc., etc. And so they had local gods. And they thought Yahweh was a local God. They didn't understand that Yahweh was the creator of the universe. But that didn't matter to them. They just wanted to get rid of these lions. Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, carry thither one of the priests whom ye brought from thence, and let them go and dwell there, and let him teach them the manner of the God of the land. Then one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel, and taught them how they should fear Yahweh. So here is the first instance, the first recorded instance of these Sephardic Jews learning about the religion of Israel, learning about the religion of our people, Israel, the religion of the Bible. Verse 29, howbeit every nation made gods of their own, and put them in the houses of high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in their cities wherein they dwelt. And the men of Babylon made Succoth Benoth, and the men of Cuth made Nergal, and the men of Hamath made Ashima, and the Avites made Nibhaz, and Tartak, the Sepharvaites burnt their children in the fire to Adrammelech, and Anemelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. So these Sepharvaic Jews brought their own gods with them, as these other nations brought their gods with them. And they began mixing the religion of the Canaanites with the religion of Israel. And this is the first instance of mixing of these traditions by anybody, because up until that point in time, the Israelites, and in fact, we were forbidden to mix with these other peoples, and we had no business teaching them our religion. But in order to get rid of these lions, these Sepharvaim and other people, these other now called Samaritans, these are your original Samaritans, wanted to find out who was the local god so they could pray to him for the removal of these lions. So verse 32 tells us, so they feared Yahweh, and made unto themselves of the lowest of them priests of the high places, which sacrificed for them in the houses of the high places. They feared Yahweh, and served their own gods at the same time, after the manner of the nations whom they carried away from thence. Unto this day they do after the former manners. It says, they fear not Yahweh, neither do they after their statutes, or after their ordinances, or after the law and commandment, which Yahweh commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. So, what happened was that these Sepharvaim temporarily worshipped Yahweh in order to get rid of the lions that were killing them. And then, of course, they reverted back to their true religion, which is Baal worship, Canaanite Baal worship. So this is the origin of the Sephardic Jews. Of course, the Sephardic Jews do not want you to know this. They want you to believe that they are Israelites. And of course, they are not Israelites. They are a completely foreign people. So, and now I want to talk a little bit about the sin of Solomon and what caused the people of Israel to be taken away and cast out of the sight of Yahweh and into the wilderness of Europe. And into this wilderness our people went for doing the same thing as the Canaanite heathen people. I'm going to quote here from the book of Nehemiah, chapter 13, beginning, I'll start with verse 19 to the end. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. This is Nehemiah speaking, and this is after the return of the 70 years captivity in Babylon. And some of my servants set I at the gates, that there should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. In other words, that we should honor the Sabbath day, and that no work should be performed on the Sabbath day. Verse 20. So the merchants and sellers of all kind of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. So he forced the merchants to stay outside of Jerusalem rather than come in. Verse 21. Then I testified against them, and said unto them, why lodge ye about the wall? If ye do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. Okay? And now to all these merchants, they weren't necessarily Israelites. They were people of all nations coming to Jerusalem to sell their wares. And so Nehemiah is telling them, get out of here. You're not supposed to be in our territory when we're trying to practice the Sabbath. Verse 22, and I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should come and keep the gates, sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. Verse 23, in those days also saw I Judahites that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Judahites' language, namely Hebrew, but according to the language of each people. So he's complaining, well, hey, our people, the Israelites, the Judahites, have mixed themselves with these foreign peoples to the extent that they could not even speak Hebrew anymore. This was horrible in the sight of Nehemiah, and it should be horrible in your eyes too. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, ye shall not. Now listen, folks. Listen, Christian Israel. Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves. What's he doing? Nehemiah is telling us we are not to mix with these people. We are not to race mix. We are supposed to keep to ourselves. Verse 26, as the Bible says, Israel shall dwell alone and shall not be counted among the nations. Now, he talks about Solomon in verse 26. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. In other words, in his old age, Solomon became a sexual pervert by having sexual relations with Canaanite women. Shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to transgress against our God in marrying strange wives? Verse 28. And one of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat, the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from thee. In other words, those priests who had engaged in race mixing were thrown out of the priesthood. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. Thus cleansed I them from all strangers, and appointed the wars of the priests and the Levites, every one in his business. So, about 150 years before these events, the house of Israel was taken captive by the Assyrians, and the Samaritans took their place. Among these Samaritans are the Jews of the Sepharvaim, the Canaanite Jews of the Sepharvaim, who began practicing a form of the Mosaic law. And then we have the returnees from the Babylonian captivity finding that these same outlandish people who surrounded the territory of Judah were trying to mix with them. And we're not to do that. As we'll find out in the next section, we're going to quote those passages of Scripture which tell us that we are supposed to remain separate and not to intermarry with these nations that were just named by Nehemiah. So, what we have to learn from this kind of information is not available in the churches, and it's certainly not available from the Jews, because the Jews want you to believe that they are Israel. White people and Christians need to know this information. Ironically, those of us who teach such important history are hated for it by Christians and Jews alike. But we take comfort in the words of Yeshua, Jesus Christ, who said, These things I command you, that you love one another, that we are to love our brethren. If the world hate you, ye know that it hated me before it hated you. If ye were of the world would love his own. But because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. The reason why the world hates us, and that includes the Judeo-Christians, is because we remain separate from the heathen. This is God's commandment. We intend to keep that commandment. No one is going to force us to intermarry with the heathen people of this world, especially the Jews. The Jews are actually heathen. They are not Israelites at all. So to sum up this section, what we see that migrants from the territory of Babylon, Ammon, Moab, and various other places, non-Israelite people, non-Israelite nations, congregated in an area called Samaria. And they began practicing a bastardized version of the laws of Moses. In fact, there is a group still today in Samaria called the Karaites, who are non-Israelite people who practice exactly this religion that we're being told about in 2 Kings chapter 17. But they are not Sephardic Jews. They do not practice the Talmud. It's a totally separate religion of their own, but it's still based on the Bible, and they claim to be Israel as well. Okay? So, but they're in fact descendants of these very same heathen people who inhabited the land in 2 Kings chapter 17. And the religion that they practiced included child sacrifice, sexual orgies in the groves, throwing their children into the fires of Molech, actually burning them alive, prostitutes in the temples, and cannibalism. These are the things that these Canaanites practiced, and the Israelites of the 10 northern tribes practiced these things as well. And that's why Yahweh took them en masse, cast them out of his sight, in order to cleanse them at a future time as the northern European, actually I should simply say the European Israelites of such countries as Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Britain, America, Australia, Italy, France, Spain, etc., because all of these nations were founded by the migrating 12 tribes, as is explained on the Migration Chronicles slideshow at anglosaxonisrael.com. So I advise you to go there to find out about this history, the true history of our people. That concludes part 2, and we have identified the origin of the Sephardic Jews in the Sepharvaim of Babylon. This is part 3 of our identification of the Jewish people. We've been detailing the history of both the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews, and in part 2 we identified the Sephardic Jews, that their origin is in ancient Babylon, from the province of the Sepharvaim people, and of course the word Sephardic comes from the Sepharvaim, and that these Sephardic Jews lived in Samaria and were always a separate people from the Israelites and the Judahites of the area. And we're going to be quoting today in this part 3. Part 3, the story of Jacob and Esau. We're going to be proving that the Israelites were constantly at war with these Canaanites and Edomites, and that Yahweh instructed our people Israel to never have marriages with them, never be like them, never have anything to do with them. However, as we found out in 2 Kings chapter 17, our people never really spent a lot of time obeying Yahweh's commandments, and that's why we have such a history of trouble. Because whenever we refuse to obey Yahweh, he punishes us in various ways. And of course, the disobedience itself is often punishment in itself. Well, because when we intermarry with non-Israelite peoples, we pick up their traits, we pick up their diseases, and we pick up their habits, and start behaving like them. And obviously Yahweh does not want us to behave like them. He wants us to behave like Israelites, like His people, like His chosen people, Israel. So, we're going to cover in part 3 an aspect of the Bible which is again given short shrift or totally ignored by Judeo-Christianity. And it's also ignored by the Jews, because the Jews do not want you to know about these things. They don't want you to know about the clear distinction between the Israelites and the Edomites. Our story begins in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. The very famous quotations which the Jews claim to be about themselves, but which is not at all about the Jews. So I'm going to quote Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Now Yahweh had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land I will show thee. And of course, that land was Canaan land. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Now these are the unconditional promises that the descendants of Abraham would be a great people. They would be a company of nations, and that Abraham himself would be a father of many nations. Verse 3, And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now he's talking to Abraham here. He's not talking to any Jews. Let me repeat this. He is talking to Abraham. He is not talking to the Jews. So these verses, in no way, shape, or form do they apply to the Jewish people. Because Abraham had 3 classes of descendants. The Ishmaelites, who are known as the Arabs today. The descendants of Isaac, through whom the covenants passed, who are known as the Anglo-Saxons today. And the sons of Keturah, who were sent east, and today are known as the Indo-Aryans. Obviously, none of these 3 groups are Jews. So this prophecy, Genesis 12:3, is fraudulently used by the Jews to apply to themselves, which it does not. Let's go to Genesis 17 and see how this story continues. Again, none of these things... Oh, and I should mention, the Jewish people have never been a blessing to any nation in which they have dwelt. And this is why in the history of the Jewish people, they have been expelled from virtually every Christian nation in their history. So if they're a blessing, why are they constantly being expelled? Why are they constantly considered to be a pestilence and a curse wherever they go? They admit these things. The Jews admit that the other nations have expelled them and that they have not blessed the nations that they've dwelt in. They admit these things. So this blessing given to Abraham does not apply to the Jews at all. Genesis 17, verses 1 through 7. And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. You will be the father of many nations, which is not true of the Jews. The Jews have been a small nation throughout history. In fact, you can't even say that they have been a nation, because they have been wanderers and, what's the term? Vagabonds in other nations, wandering to and fro from one nation to another, none of which they built. The Jews have not built any nations, not a single one, not even the Israeli state, because they stole that from the Palestinians. So the Jewish people have not built a single nation in the history of the world. They cannot possibly be the descendants of Abraham that are being mentioned here. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, And God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. How many nations have the Jews founded? 0. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be called Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. That's what the word Abraham means, father of many nations. Verse 6, And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. The Jews don't have any kings at all in their entire history. They have no kings except for Herod and his 3 or 4 successors. Other than that, the Jews have had no kings. And Herod was not an Israelite. He was an Edomite, as we will prove. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee. Thy seed after thee, meaning your direct descendants, Abraham, your direct descendants and nobody else. To be for an everlasting covenant. An everlasting covenant. I stress that for the Judeo-Christians who teach that the covenant that Yahweh made with his people, the Abrahamites and the Israelites and the Anglo-Saxons, somehow changed at the New Testament with the terms of the New Covenant. No, they did not change at all. Because you've got the identification of Israel wrong. You believe that the Jews are Israel. And of course, the Jews did reject Messiah. But we Israelites did not. And because we are the true Israelites, the New Covenant applies to us. And we were redeemed, but the Jews rejected the terms of the New Testament precisely because they're not Israelites. That covenant had nothing to do with them. This is an everlasting covenant. So if you teach that this covenant was changed, you're calling God a liar. Verse 8, And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So that land belongs to us. It belongs to us. It doesn't belong to the Jews. In fact, we gave it to them because the British Empire is actually one of the Commonwealth nations prophesied here, one of the many nations coming from the loins of Abraham. And it was the British who liberated Palestine from the Turks and claimed the British Mandate. So it was put back into our possession. Yahweh gave it back to us after first it was conquered by the Romans, and then by the Muslims, and then by the Turks. And it was still possessed, and that entire territory was possessed by the Arabs in the interim. Okay? So, but it belongs to us. It doesn't belong to the Jews. And when Netanyahu goes on television and says, oh, we Jews, that this land from the river Egypt to Tigris and Euphrates, Eretz Israel, belongs to us, that's history's biggest lie. He knows that he's not an Israelite. He's in fact a Khazar Jew. So this is just part of the great deception, Revelation 12:9, that the Jews engage in constantly, and the world swallows this nonsense whole, hook, line, and sinker, because they hear it so often with the Jewish control of the media and control of the publishing industry. We never hear anybody contradict these lies. So you may be hearing the contradiction of these lies for the first time in your life. And praise Yahweh if you are hearing this at all. Because the Jews are doing everything in their power to prevent you from getting this knowledge. Now we're going to continue in Genesis chapter 25, because I want to prove to you that only Abraham's direct descendants are the recipients and inheritors of these covenants. Verse 5, And Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac, but unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts, and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived eastward unto the east country. Now why did he do this? Because the covenants were to proceed through Isaac. That's why he sent Ishmael away. That's why he sent the sons of Keturah away. So the sons of Hagar and the sons of Keturah were sent away, and only Isaac remained, because the covenants were to proceed through Isaac, not through these other sons. Verse 20. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padanaram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now, of course, this means she was a Shemite. Rebekah was a Shemite. Verse 21. And Isaac entreated Yahweh for his wife because she was barren. And Yahweh was entreated of him. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived. And the children struggled together within her. And she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of Yahweh. So you have to picture. Now remember, Rebekah is a flesh and blood woman. This is not mythology. This is not made up stuff. This is biblical history. If the Bible says it happened, it happened. Rebekah had twins, 2 boys. And they struggled within her. So you have to try to put yourself in Rebekah's place. You're feeling in your belly the 2 boys duking it out. They're wrestling with each other. And she's saying, why is this happening to you? Why is this happening to me? And here is God's answer. He says, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. Okay? Well, let me finish this section. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb, and the first came out red, all over like an hairy garment. And they called his name Esau. And after that came out his brother, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. So, 2 nations. 2 nations. Not just 2 twin sons, but 2 nations are to come out of Rebekah's womb. The Edomites, the descendants of Esau, and the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob. 2 completely different nations have come out of Rebekah's womb. How often has your minister informed you of this fact? So, let's fast forward. Jacob and Esau are twin brothers, and of course, Esau is the older. But the prophecy says that the older shall serve the younger. How did this all come about? Well, we know that when Jacob was in the field, because Jacob became a farmer, Esau rejected farming, and he was actually a highwayman. Now let's go into the story of Jacob receiving the inheritance from Esau and how this came about. And the Bible tells us, and the boys grew up, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison. In other words, Esau was a hunter who brought back plenty of game for his father Isaac to eat. But Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob sowed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. And therefore was his name called Edom. Okay, so Esau's name is changed to Edom. And Jacob said, "Sell me this day thy birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me this day." And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Now the churches and the Jews too will teach you that Jacob somehow tricked Esau into this deal. There's no trickery involved here. Esau came out of the field. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright. If you want to eat my pottage, sell me your birthright." Simple deal. There's no trickery involved. If Esau had any brains, he never would have done this. But we'll find out why he did this. The record of why he did this is not contained in the Bible. It's contained in the book of Jasher. And I will quote that very, very shortly. But the important thing is that Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, and it was a fair deal, a done deal. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Very important point. Esau despised his birthright. He counted his birthright as meaning nothing. He discounted his birthright. That's not a very intelligent thing to do. And any of you Israelites, if you despise your birthright, despise your Israelite heritage, you are doing the exact same thing that Esau did. And you will be judged accordingly. That's what the Bible tells us. So in the book of Jasher, chapter 27, we are given the details of why Esau was faint. The Bible tells us he was faint and on the point to die. But why he was at this stage, we're not told, but the book of Jasher explained. Chapter 27, verse 1. And Esau, at that time after the death of Abraham, frequently went in the field to hunt. And Nimrod, king of Babel, the same was Amraphel, also frequently went with his mighty men to hunt in the field, and to walk about with his men in the cool of the day. And Nimrod was observing Esau all the days, for a jealousy was formed in the heart of Nimrod against Esau all the days. So Nimrod saw Esau moving about the countryside, and there was an enmity, or the Jasher says a jealousy arose between them. And on a certain day Esau went into the field to hunt, and he found Nimrod walking in the wilderness with his 2 men. So Nimrod with his 2 assistants doing some hunting. And all his mighty men and his people were with him in the wilderness, but they removed at a distance from him, and they went from him in different directions to hunt. And Esau concealed himself from Nimrod, and he lurked for him in the wilderness. So he set up an ambush for Nimrod. And Nimrod and his men that were with him did not know him. And Nimrod and his men frequently walked about in the field at the cool of the day, and to know where his men were hunting in the field. And Nimrod and 2 of his men that were with him came to the place where they were. And when Esau started suddenly from his lurking place, drew his sword, hastened and ran to Nimrod and cut off his head. And Esau fought a desperate fight with the 2 men that were with Nimrod, and when they called out to him, Esau turned to them and smote them to death with his sword. And all the mighty men of Nimrod who had left him to go to the wilderness heard the cry at a distance, and they knew the voices of those 2 men, and they ran to know the cause of it when they found their king and the 2 men that were with him lying dead in the wilderness. And when Esau saw the mighty men of Nimrod coming at a distance, he fled, and thereby escaped. And Esau took the valuable garments of Nimrod, which Nimrod's father had bequeathed to Nimrod, and with which Nimrod prevailed over the whole land, and he ran and concealed them in his house. And Esau took these garments and ran into the city on account of Nimrod's men. And he came into his father's house wearied and exhausted from fight. And he was ready to die through grief when he approached his brother Jacob and sat before him. So, these details fill in the missing part of why Esau was faked. He was running away from Nimrod's men who were chasing him. And it's quite obvious that Esau thought they might catch up with him and kill him. And this is why he so quickly and easily sold his birthright to Jacob. You cannot blame Jacob for Esau's stupidity and for Esau daring to cut off the head of Nimrod. That's a very daring act. And the book of Jasher tells us furthermore that Esau was a highwayman who would rob people along the road. So Esau was not your best character of moral standing whatsoever. So we find out from the book of Genesis that Esau despised his birthright, and the book of Jasher tells us why he did so. He was afraid he was going to die momentarily. So you cannot blame you cannot blame Jacob for the sins of Esau. Now let's continue to Deuteronomy chapter 7, because we're going to find out that the Israelites were forbidden to intermarry with these Canaanites and Edomites, the Edomites being the descendants of Esau, Edom. Okay, and Genesis chapter 6 tells us all about these descendants of Esau, who had a separate civilization in the area of Mount Seir, and they were the enemies of Israel throughout their entire existence. And as I've said, they are still our enemies even today. It's just that we have misidentified them as the Israelites of the Old Testament, when they in fact are the Edomites of the Old Testament. Okay, so in Deuteronomy chapter 7, I'm going to quote verses 1 through 7. So that you know the law, which our people have been disobeying, to our hurt. When Yahweh thy Elohim shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when Yahweh your Elohim shall deliver them from before thee, thou shalt smite them, and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. So, Christians, the modern New Testament Christians, so-called, look at these verses and say, oh, well, Yahweh is that old vengeful God. We don't believe in that God. We believe in Jesus, the God of love. Well, if you actually read the New Testament, Jesus is coming back to destroy these very same people. They're the terrors of Matthew chapter 13. So there's no difference between the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament. It's just that the justice has been delayed from the first coming to the second coming. That's nonsensical teaching that Jesus told us to carry a sword. He told us to carry a sword, and he will judge his enemies, and his vesture will be dipped in blood. Now that's nonsense, what these so-called New Testament Christians teach. I want to quote from Wycliffe. Wycliffe translated the Hebrew Bible into English, directly from the Hebrew. And this is his commentary on Deuteronomy chapter 7, which is much more informed and intelligent than what the Judeo-Christians teach today. Verses 1 through 5, his commentary. In the book of the covenant produced at Sinai, there was promulgated a program of conquest and extermination against the Canaanite people and cultus. Thereby, the ancient prophecy in which Noah pronounced Canaan accursed and the servant of Shem would be fulfilled. The hour of divine judgment having come, Moses now charged Israel with the execution of that program. Everybody and everything in Canaan that was consecrated to idols rather than to the service of God must be consecrated to the wrath of God. 7 nations. In such lists elsewhere, the number varies from 3 to 10. The 7 specified here possibly is a figure of the completeness. The Hebrew root HRM, translated utterly destroy, in the major English versions, means primarily to devote and hence ban and extirpate. The harem principle comes to full and final manifestation in the judgments of hell. So the judgment of the Canaanites began here, but it will be completed at the second coming. Some people take offense at God's command to Israel to exterminate the Canaanites, as though it represented sub-Christian ethics. Actually, they are taking offense at the theology and religion of the Bible as a whole. Well said. Let me repeat this. Actually, they are taking offense at the theology and religion of the Bible as a whole. The New Testament, as well as the Old, warns men concerning the realm of the everlasting ban, where the reprobates devoted to wrath must magnify the justice of God, whom they have hated. There are still people today who hate Yahweh. You think Yahweh is going to tolerate them forever? He's not going to tolerate them forever. That's why he established the judgment day. Since Old Testament theocracy in Canaan was a divinely appointed symbol of the consummate kingdom of God, there is found, and of course the religion that the Israelites practice, not the Canaanites practice, there is found in connection with it an intrusive anticipation of the ethical pattern that will obtain at the final judgment and beyond. So, what was Yahweh doing? He was using the Israelites as his tool of judgment against these evil Canaanites. Now, Yahweh could have done this himself. He could have brought a plague of hail, or he could have had a tidal wave come off the Mediterranean and swamp over the Canaanite people. But he wanted the Israelite people to understand what their duty was. What he was expecting them to do was to be his battle axe, his instrument of judgment against these heathen, evil people, the Canaanites. In other words, they were unredeemable. They were so evil that they could not be redeemed, and therefore Yahweh instructed his people Israel to exterminate them. Continuing with Wycliffe. Moreover, the extermination of the Canaanites and their cultic installations, namely destroy their altars, burn their images, was necessary if Israel's calling to positive consecration to God in living service was to be fulfilled. For because of Israel's frailty, they were a small number of people compared to their enemies at this time. The proximity of the Canaanites would lead to the dissolution of Israel's spiritual distinctiveness and national distinctiveness, to foreign and idolatrous allegiances, and hence to Israel's own destruction. The program of conquest is thus a consistent application of the principle of consecration, that is, the consecration of the people of Israel, dedicating us to Yahweh, and only we are so dedicated. But of course, we already found out, as Wycliffe anticipated, that the Israelites would not do a thorough job, and they would leave a remnant of Canaanites to make life difficult for us. And this is prophesied in the book of Numbers, chapter 33, verse 55. And these words are so true of our experience vis-a-vis the Jews. This is one of the greatest prophecies in the Bible, where Yahweh tells the Israelites, quote, "But if you will not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come to pass that those which ye let remain of them shall be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and shall vex you in the land wherein ye dwell. Moreover, it shall come to pass that I shall do unto you as I thought to do unto them." So if we do like them, he's going to punish us just like he asked us to punish them. And of course, Deuteronomy 33:55 has come fully to pass throughout our history, because wherever we true Israelites have gone, the Jews have been pricks in our eyes and thorns in our sides ever since. The Jews will simply not leave us alone. Now, we already covered Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 23 through 29, because we stressed that in the previous section, proving that we are not to intermarry with these Canaanites. Deuteronomy chapter 7 also tells us they were not to intermarry with Canaanites, that we are not even to have any covenants with them. But Solomon violated this principle when he married Canaanite wives. So now we're going to talk about how these Sephardic Jews, these Canaanite Jews, these Edomite Jews, came to covet Israel, came to covet our land, our territory, and our religion. Now, we talked about them beginning to utilize their own version of our religion in 2 Kings chapter 17. But the book of Ezekiel prophesied that there would be a time when these Edomites would covet our land and our religion. Okay, so Ezekiel chapter 35 and 36 cover this prophecy, and it's directly related to the Herodians who assumed control of Judea just before the days of Christ. So I'm going to quote Ezekiel chapter 35, verses 1 through 15. In fact, that's the whole chapter of Ezekiel 35. Moreover, the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Mount Seir, and prophesy against it. Mount Seir is where the Edomites lived. And say unto it, Thus saith Yahweh Elohim, Behold, Mount Seir, I am against thee, and I will stretch out mine hand against thee, and I will make thee most desolate. I will lay thy cities waste, and thou shalt be a desolate people, and thou shalt know that I am God, I am Yahweh. Well, when Yahweh starts, slaying your people before your very eyes, and he says he's going to do that, and when it finally happens, that's when you know that he keeps his promises. Verse 5, Because thou hast had a perpetual hatred, and hast shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword in the time of their calamity, in the time that their iniquity had an end. So what Yahweh is telling us is that whenever the Edomites had the opportunity, they would attack our people Israel and slay us. Because thou hast had this perpetual hatred, he will ultimately judge the Edomites. Therefore, as I live, saith Yahweh Elohim, I will prepare thee unto blood, and blood shall pursue thee. Since thou hast not hated blood, even blood shall pursue thee. In other words, since they have not rejected the principle of killing and murdering, they will ultimately be killed themselves. Thus will I make Mount Seir most desolate, and cut off from it him that passeth out it, and him that returneth. Well, who's coming and going from Mount Seir? The Edomite Jews. That's who he's talking about here. And I will fill his mountain with his slain men. In thy hills and in thy valleys and on all thy rivers shall they fall that are slain with the sword. I will make thee perpetual desolations, and thy cities shall not return, and ye shall know that I am Yahweh. So Yahweh has actually been judging these Edomite Jews perpetually since this prophecy was issued. And in fact, these Jews today inhabit Mount Seir. They have taken possession of Mount Seir again as Ashkenazis and as Edomites, as Sephardim. This is the true fulfillment of the return. The Jews have returned to Mount Seir. Verse 10, because thou hast said, these two nations and these two countries shall be mine. What's he talking about? The house of Israel, house of Judah, Samaria and Judea. These two nations and these two countries shall be mine, and we will possess it. Whereas Yahweh was there. So, here are these Sephardic Edomite Jews declaring their intention to take possession of the two houses, the territory of the two houses. Therefore, as I live, saith Yahweh, I will even do according to thine anger and according to thine envy, which thou hast used out of thy hatred against them, and I will make myself known among them when I have judged thee. Well, their full judgment has not occurred yet. It's about to come. Because the Ashkenazi and Edomite Jews have taken possession of Palestine for a second time. They did it the first time in the days of Herod. And the fulfillment of Yahweh's displeasure, anger against the Edomites and the Ashkenazis is yet to come at a future date. But we believe it's going to be very shortly. And we're going to take a quick break, and we'll cover the fulfillment, the first fulfillment of this prophecy that these Edomites are going to possess the land of Israel and Judah. And after this break, we'll complete the story of Yahweh's hatred and judgment against Esau. We're back with part 4 of our study on who are the Jewish people. And we've been focusing for the previous 2 sections, parts 2 and 3, on the Sephardic Jews, who they really are. And we're going to continue part 4. This is our concluding section. And we're going to entitle it The Edomites of Idumea, because we've identified the Jews of the Middle East, the Sephardic Jews, with the Edomites and the Canaanites, the Babylonian Sepharvaim, and related people who actually surrounded the nation of Judah after the northern 10 tribes were deported by the Assyrians. And this was Yahweh's judgment on the 10 northern tribes because they had engaged in Baal worship. In other words, they had engaged in the religion practiced by these heathen Canaanites, Edomites, and Babylonians. And then those same Babylonian people were inserted into Samaria by the king of Assyria and have inhabited that territory ever since, actually, known as Samaritans, known as Edomites, known as Canaanites, and even some of the Arabs were part of this conglomeration of people. So we left off at Ezekiel 35, and we read that whole chapter establishing the fact that these Edomites lusted after the nation of Judah, the territory of Judah. We're going to pick up with Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 1 through 5, which continues this theme that these Edomites would one day wish to displace the house of Judah in Judea. Verse 1, also, thou son of man, prophesy unto the mountains of Israel, that is, the leadership of Israel, and say, ye mountains of Israel, hear the word of Yahweh. Thus saith Yahweh Elohim, because the enemy hath said against you, aha, even the ancient high places are ours in possession. Okay, well, these Edomites now possess these lands. Therefore prophesy and say, thus saith Yahweh Elohim, because they have made you desolate, and swallowed you up on every side, that ye might be a possession unto the residue of the heathen, and ye are taken up in the lips of talkers, and are an infamy of the people. Therefore, ye mountains of Israel, hear the word of Yahweh your God. Thus saith the Lord God to the mountains, that is, to the leaders, to the people, the kings and queens and nobles of Israel, and to the hills, and to the rivers, and to the valleys, to the desolate wastes, and to the cities that are forsaken, which became a prey and a derision to the residue of the heathen that are round about. Therefore thus saith Yahweh God, Surely in the fire of my jealousy have I spoken against the residue of the heathen, and against all Idumea. What's Idumea? Idumea is the Greek word for Edom. It's the land of Edom, which have appointed my land into their possession with the joy of all their heart, with despiteful minds, to cast it out for a prey. In other words, these Edomites, being the descendants of Esau, knowing the trickery of Jacob when he stole the blessing from Esau. Not the inheritance, because the inheritance was something completely different. The inheritance Esau sold to Jacob, and it was a fair deal, a done deal. No trickery involved whatsoever. However, as all Christians should know, Jacob impersonated Esau by putting on a hairy garment to fool Isaac that he was actually Esau. And we'll talk about that prophecy toward the end of this presentation. Also, we want to establish the importance of this issue of who the Edomites are. The churches say virtually nothing about this, and of course the Jews don't teach anything about this either, because they don't want you to know their true heritage. They don't want you to know their true ancestry. Psalm 83 tells us, "Keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thou peace, and be not still. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they hate thee, have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people," that's us, the true Israel people, "and consulted against thy hidden ones." Who are the hidden ones? Well, we Israelites, the true Israelites, have been hidden from history. We lost our identity when we migrated up north through the Caucasus Mountains and became known as the Anglo-Saxons and as the Caucasians. We abandoned our Israelite customs and forgot who we are. Even though the Bible actually prophesies there will come a time near the end, near the judgment day, that we will remember who we are. And it continues, "They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance." And we indeed forgot that we are Israel. "For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee, the tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gibal, and Ammon, and Amalek, the Philistines, with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also is joined with them. They have helped the children of Lot. Do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin, at the brook of Kison, which perished. At Endor they became as dung for the earth." And it continues on in this vein, that there's an entire group of people, all non-Israelites, confederate against us. And of course the Edomites are the leaders of this confederation. And in Obadiah, the book of Obadiah, I want you to understand that the Bible stresses this, the iniquity of this people called Edom, named after Esau. And Yahweh hates these people, and he intends to destroy them totally at the end of the age. Which proves, and the fact that the prophecies take us to the end of the age, proves that these Edomites are still with us. So who are they? Who are the Edomites in the world? They're not the Palestinians. They're the people who are pretending to be Israel and who have deceived the whole world. Obadiah, verse 1. "The vision of Obadiah. Thus says Yahweh God concerning Edom. We have heard a rumor from Yahweh, and an ambassador is sent among the heathen. Arise ye, and let us rise up against her in battle. Behold, I have made thee small among the heathen. Thou art greatly despised." In other words, these Edomites are just as despised as the Jews have been throughout history, because they're the same people. Today's Jews derive from these Edomite Canaanites. Verse 3, "The pride of thine heart hath deceived thee, thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, Who shall bring me down to the ground? Though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, And though thou set thy nest among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith Yahweh. So let's look at the world today. Who are the most powerful people in the world today? They're the Jewish bankers, they're the Jewish merchants, the media masters, who are also Jews, the economics people, the Federal Reserve Bank, the warmongers of the Zionists. These are the people who are causing all the wars. This is Mystery Babylon. Mystery Babylon, the world empire of merchants prophesied in the book of Revelation. All of these entities, the United Nations, New World Order, all these entities are controlled by Jews, by Edomite and Khazar Jews. So we're talking about this world empire of merchants in the last days is going to be destroyed by Yahweh. Let me also quote verses 10 through 15. Edom's unpardonable sin, for thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. In the day that thou stoodest on the other side, in the day that the strangers carried away captive his forces, that is, Israel's forces, and foreigners entered into his gates, and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even thou wast one of them. But thou shouldst not have looked on the day of thy brother, on the day that he became a stranger, and when he was carried off. Neither shouldst thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. Neither shouldst thou have spoken proudly in the day of distress, that is, Israel's distress. Thou shouldst not have entered into the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Yea, thou shouldst not have looked on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor have laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. So this is all verifying that these Edomites, whenever they had the opportunity, they would make war against us, but they always lived in the vicinity of Judah and Israel. Because why? Well, because as descendants of Esau, Edom, they coveted the old relationship they had under Abraham. But when Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, he gave up any and all claims to the inheritance. So just as Jacob impersonated Esau, the Edomites are now impersonating Israel. It's a vengeful act. They're getting even with us because our ancestor Jacob Israel impersonated Esau. The Edomite Jews are today impersonating Jacob. And of course this began in the Middle East in the days of Herod. So we need to go into the history of those days, starting with King John Hyrcanus, who was one of the last kings of the house of Judah in Judea, and how the Edomites conspired against Judah to take over our nation, the house of Judah, the two-tribed house of Judah in Judea. Josephus, the Judean historian, writes in the 13th book of his Antiquities of the Judeans that John Hyrcanus took by force all of the cities round about Jerusalem in this manner. And I just described the people who lived round about Jerusalem, these various tribes, including the Edomites. He took Medaba. After this he took Samega and the neighboring places, and besides these Shechem and Gerizim, Samaria, and the nation of the Cuthians, who dwelt at the temple, which resembled that temple which was at Jerusalem, because they built replicas of the Jerusalem temple for themselves and then worshipped Canaanite gods in those same temples. And which Alexander permitted Sanballat, the general of his army, to build for the sake of Manasseh. We're talking about Alexander the Great back in those days. And he allowed the Manassites to build a temple there, who was son-in-law to Jaddua the high priest, as we have formerly related, which temple was now deserted 200 years after it was built. So we're talking about the days of John Hyrcanus. We're talking roughly 150 BC. Hyrcanus also took Dora and Marissa, cities of Idumea. Remember, Idumea is simply the Greek version of the word for Edom. And subdued all the Idumeans, and permitted them to stay in that country if they would circumcise their genitals and make use of the laws of the Judahites. Now remember, going back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, Yahweh absolutely forbids us from making covenants with Canaanites. And the Canaanite people became known as Edomites when Esau became their leader. And that's covered in Genesis chapter 36. So these Canaanites henceforth became known as Edomites. And so if we can't make covenants with Canaanites, we can't make covenants with Edomites either. We can't make covenants with, in fact, Yahweh forbids us to make covenants with anybody except within our own house. Okay? So the house of Judah can make a covenant with the house of Israel, and we can make covenants with Shemites because we derive from the Shemites and the Hebrews, etc. But not with any other people. So what John Hyrcanus did was a total violation of the law. Now why did he do this? Well, because the house of Judah was pretty much standing alone against all these heathen people round about. So Josephus thought, well, maybe he was doing a good thing by making allies of these Edomites whom he had just conquered. But this was the biggest mistake of his life. And then these Edomites say, and they were so desirous of living in the country of their forefathers from which they had been expelled. Okay? Well, who expelled them? The Israelites. The Israelites had expelled them under Joshua. So they were covetous of going back and taking possession of that land. This is very clear that the Edomites, or the former Canaanites, were expelled from Judea by the Israelites and now coveted the return to that place. And they still covet returning to that place today, not as Israelites, but as Edomites. So that they submitted to the use of circumcision and the rest of the Judahite ways of living, at which time therefore this befell them, that they were thereafter known as none other than Jews. So what we see is that when John Hyrcanus conquered the nation of Idumea, he gave them an ultimatum: either you circumcise your foreskins or I run you through with the sword. In other words, circumcision or death. Well, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to take circumcision. Far less painful than being run through with a sword. But this enabled these Idumeans to enter our company, ultimately to usurp the nation of Judah. Now the exact date that the first Edomite was circumcised was 121 BC. So we can trace this act of John Hyrcanus, this violation of Yahweh's laws, to that exact date. The two nations were actually brought together around 125 BC, so therefore you had the land of Judah and the land of Edom, or known then of course as Idumea, brought together. Judah, Idumea, you shorten the two, it becomes Judea. So the combined nation thenceforth was known as Judea. But we still have two separate and distinct people living in the same country, the Judahites and the Edomites. They were never truly combined together. We know from Josephus that the women of Judah demonstrated constantly against Herod, who became the king, because they knew that he was not a Judahite. They knew that he was an Edomite. And so, continuing to trace the history of the Judahite people in Judea, I want to quote the words of Dr. Wesley Swift, who has this to say about the forced, not conversion. Well, it really wasn't a conversion to the laws of Moses, because there was a violation of the laws of Moses to actually bring them in our company. So what it really is it's the beginning of the end of the Mosaic law in Judah. By accepting a non-Judahite people into our company who proceeded to pervert the laws of Moses and who proceeded to pervert as much as they could our people, Judah. This is what Dr. Wesley Swift has to say, referring to the new covenant, which was actually prophesied in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 37. This was the new covenant, and applies only to Israelites, doesn't apply to anybody else. That when Jesus said, I come not but unto the lost sheep or exiled sheep of the house of Israel, that when Jesus in the upper room with his disciples broke unto them the bread and the wine of his atonement, and said that this blood is the new covenant, the new contract between Israel and Yahweh. And in the Apostle Paul's writing concerning the communion, he writes that this is the new covenant, the blood of the new covenant. It's still a blood covenant. The people, the blood of Israel, of the old covenant, the blood of Israel in the new covenant. Jesus was an Israelite, not a Jew, not an Edomite, not a Khazar. He was an Israelite. What does this talk about? It is talk about so great a salvation. It is talk about Christianity and the expansion of it. And the house of Israel and the house of Judah were to be Christians within Christian nations. The house of Israel and the house of Judah are Christian nations in the days of Christ. Judah and Benjamin in the land of Galilee became Christian. The Galileans were among the strong supporters of the early Christian church, and organized Jewry was neither Judah nor Benjamin. Page 9, The Controversy Over Judah, Proof that the Jews are not Judah, by Dr. Wesley Swift. So, we in identity understand that the Jews are actually usurpers of the heritage of Israel. And it's really obvious that the Jews did not accept Jesus as their Messiah. Why didn't they accept him? Why would they reject redemption? Why would they reject having their sins forgiven and going into the kingdom? Why would they reject that? Well, it wasn't part of their tradition. They were Edomites. They were not Judahites. Continuing with Josephus, in Book 14, Chapter 16, Paragraph 3. The day that Herod's Edomite kinsmen were finally allowed into the temple. Remember, these Edomites, these Idumeans, coveted going back into the land of their forefathers, which the Israelites had evicted them from. And now Herod, having overcome his enemies, his care was to govern those foreigners who had been his assistants, Edomites. For the crowd of strangers rushed to see the temple and the sacred things in the temple. These were put there by Israel and Judah, not by these Edomite Jews. There is no doubt that the Kenite scribes had been anticipating this development for centuries. As I said earlier, the Kenite, Edomite, Canaanite people who came under the authority of Esau began lusting after this territory and had anticipated back in the Psalm 83. They conspire against us. They're conspiring against Israel to make us not a people and to take over what Esau had foolishly given away and despised. That's the important word. Esau despised his birthright. But nevertheless, hoping to make up for Esau's mistake, they conspired against the Israelites to try to take over Judea in these days just before Christ. So our modern Judeo-Christian preachers know nothing of these things, nor do the Jews teach it either, because they want you to believe that they're the Israel of the Bible. Nor would they inform us even if they knew, for their loyalty is to Zionism. So what we have today is we have Jewish Zionists and we have Christian Zionists, neither of whom appreciate the fact that the Jews aren't Israel. They're giving their allegiance to the Antichrist, thinking they're doing God's service. Of course, they have been tricked into doing Satan's service because they are uplifting by donations and by false belief, the synagogue of Satan. And Zionism is simply one aspect of the religion of the synagogue of Satan, namely Talmudism. These foreigners, being Herod's assistants and ambitious pagan priests from Idumea and Sepharad, were to become the new government and priesthood of Judea. Now, do you understand the importance of this history? In other words, unless you understand that Herod was an Idumean, and that's the reason why he wanted to kill baby Jesus, so he couldn't be born and grow up into being the heir of the throne of Judah. That's why he wanted to kill baby Jesus. If you don't understand that, you don't know what's going on in New Testament times. This was a battle not between good Jews and bad Jews. It was a battle between the Judahites and the Edomites, who began impersonating us right after John Hyrcanus began circumcising them. So what happened was, once he did that, he gave these Edomite Jews the opportunity to infiltrate the government of Judah. And what did Herod do? Well, he did great evil in the land of Judah. Against Apion, Josephus tells us, "For our forefathers did not only appoint the best of these priests," and he's talking about the various priesthoods of Israel, including the Levitical priests, that those that attended upon the divine worship for that design from the beginning, but made provision that the stock of the priests should continue unmixed and pure. For he who is partaker of the priesthood must propagate of a wife of the same nation." In other words, he's telling us we cannot have race-mixed priests. They must be Israelites. But these Idumeans are clearly a different stock of people. They're our enemies, the Edomites. To cement the Idumean stranglehold over true Judah, Herod, when he saw that there was little political resistance to his coup, and that's what it was a coup, because Herod, being the son of Antipater, another Idumean, who was put into power by Antipater bribing Julius Caesar and installing him as governor of Galilee, he used the Roman army to invade the land of Judah and take over the country. That's how Herod became king over Judea. But he could never be king over Judah because he was not an Israelite. It's just that simple. None of the historians of Judeo-Christianity or the Jews will tell you these things. But this is the true history of the land of Judea in these days. So when Herod, when he saw that there was little political resistance to his coup, assassinated the entire Sanhedrin so that he could install his Idumean cronies in their places. There's no better way to describe the situation than rule by proxy. This fact is documented by Josephus in his Antiquities, Book 14, Chapter 9, Paragraph 4. If you read Josephus carefully, you will begin to appreciate what a brutal monster Herod was. Just as importantly, you will realize that he was an Edomite, as Josephus attests on numerous occasions, and he was not a Judahite. This explains his ravenous desire to exterminate the Hasmonean dynasty. What's that? The dynasty of King David. Secular history, numerous biblical passages, and numerous apocryphal passages confirm the fact that the Judahites of Judea strove with all of their might to preserve their separate and distinct ethnicity and religion. Not even Jewish scholars dispute this fact, but they rarely, if ever, discuss it in public. In my various essays on this subject, located at www.anglo-saxonisrael.com, I have dissected the false claims of the Jews. I have proven without any shadow of doubt that Judaism's claim to a biblical origin is history's greatest deception. And Jesus tells them to their faces that they are the synagogue of Satan. John chapter 8, verses 32 through 34. And in Matthew chapter 23, he accuses them as well. And it says that they have distorted the teachings of Moses by their own traditions. Why don't the churches teach this? They don't teach it because they're covering up for the synagogue of Satan. Because of their 501c3 status, they have to obey the IRS, not the Bible. So this is history's greatest con game, that the Jews have been impersonating Israel for these last 2,000 years. Since Jesus repeatedly accused the Jews of creating their own traditions, the tradition of men, the traditions of the elders, as they're referred to in the Bible, in total violation of Deuteronomy 4:2, which forbids any priest from changing the written law of Moses. And the Talmudic rabbis do this all the time. That's what Talmudism is. Talmudism is changing the laws of Moses. It's not adhering to them. Jesus was actually upholding the Mosaic law against the rabbis, while accusing these same Pharisees to their faces of being impostors. Therefore, Jesus was not a Jew by religion. He was not a Jew by race, because we're defining Jew as one who pretends to be a Judahite or an Israelite. That is, an Edomite who pretends to be an Israelite. That's what a Jew really is. He was a Mosaic Judahite. The popular confusion of the Mosaic law with the satanic teachings of Judaism is one of the greatest propaganda coups in history. The sacrificial rituals of the Old Testament were part of the Old Covenant, and these rituals were done away with. What was nailed to the cross in Colossians 2:14 was chirographon, that is the list of sins, the indictment against the people of Israel, so that those sins could be forgiven. The law was not nailed to the cross, as these false Christian churches teach. That was not nailed. The law was not nailed to the cross. The indictment was nailed to the cross. The law still continues. It's fully in effect. We're not to disobey the law. In fact, Paul even says that sin is still with us, and we could not be judged at the judgment day if there were no law. So the law is still fully in effect. It's just we don't have the ritual sacrifices as a crutch to lean on for the forgiveness of sins. Now we're going to have to face our Maker at the judgment day, because Jesus says we will be judged according to our works, not according to our beliefs. So you better act in a moral manner, in a biblically moral manner, if you expect to enter the kingdom. So if the Judahites, if the Edomites were the Judahites of the Old Covenant, they would gladly have accepted the New Covenant. Why would you reject having your sins be forgiven? Why would that be stupid? It would be ridiculous to reject such a proposition. Who in his right mind would refuse to have his sins forgiven by Messiah? Only the Jews would be so fanatical and foolish. But since the Sephardic Jews of that time were Edomites and Canaanites, jealous of true Israel, they conspired to kill Jesus because they knew that his blood sacrifice would not apply to them. So it didn't matter if they killed him. That's why they boldly proclaimed, "His blood be upon us and our children." Matthew chapter 27, verse 25. Because they're not Israelites, they conspired to put him to death. Is this clear? This should really be clear. That the Israelites would never have put the Messiah to death, because that would be cutting themselves off from the kingdom. That would be the stupidest thing they could ever do. But since the prophecy of the New Covenant did not apply to these Edomites, And the Pharisees were largely Edomites, although there were some. Nicodemus was probably a Judahite. But it's just like in the world today. We have Christians who become Messianic Jews, thinking that Judaism is the religion of the Old Testament. And so they're confused. They've been deceived by Jewish theology, by the Jewish assumption of the identity of Israel. And these Christians think they're becoming better Christians, or they're becoming Jews or Judahites by adopting Messianic Judaism. But the Messianic Jews do not accept that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. They don't accept him. So if you don't accept him as the Messiah, you can't be a Christian. So if a Christian becomes a Messianic Jew, he's denying Christianity. It's just that simple. Furthermore, the Jews today want to reestablish the animal sacrifices. They want to tear down the Dome of the Rock, which is of course a Muslim monument, and establish another sacrificial temple there. Well, that would be the greatest blasphemy the world has ever seen. That would certainly enrage Yahweh, because, as Paul says, that was the last sacrifice. When Jesus was nailed to the cross, that was the last sacrifice. There is to be no more sacrifice. And anybody who tries to reestablish that will it'll be a slap in the face of Yahweh. It'll be a slap in the face of Jesus Christ. So when the Jews attempt to do this, I guarantee you that Yahweh will finally execute judgment upon these Edomites, and that will be the last thing they ever accomplish in this world, if they ever dare to do so. So, I think on that note I can conclude this series, that we have established beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Jewish people have no blood relationship whatsoever to Israel and Judah, nor is their religion in any way, shape, or form connected to the laws of Moses. It's all deception. It's all historical deception. And that the people who are claiming to be Israel and Judah today are actually Edomites and Khazars, who have no right to that territory whatsoever, and anybody who thinks that they do and supports them is actually supporting the Antichrist and supporting the synagogue of Satan. The prophecies make this very clear. And in fact, Isaac promised Esau, he made a prophecy to Esau, that one day you will break Jacob's yoke from off your neck. This prophecy was made back in Genesis 27. What does that mean? Well, because the Edomites were tributaries to and often slaves to the Israelites, that the Edomites would be servants of the Israelites. But one day that yoke would be broken off their neck. Well, when did this happen? It happened in 1948, when these Edomites laid claim for the second time to the land of Palestine. This is the world's greatest deception, folks. The claim that the Jews are the Israelites of the Bible and have right to that territory. It's the world's biggest lie. Don't you believe it? Open your eyes, see the light. That we Caucasians are the true Israelites. The Jews are imposters impersonating Israel, and they are in fact Edom. Edom and Ashkenaz, and they have no business telling us what to do, have no business trying to take control of that area which belongs to us. In the name of Yahweh, I thank you for listening to this message. Let this message be proclaimed throughout the white Christian nations of the world so they understand the nature of the deception that has taken place for the last 2,000 years. Remove the scales from the eyes of your people Israel. Let them be awakened to the true nature of the deception that's going on in the world today. Jesus told us, "Be not deceived, beware of wolves in sheep's clothing. Come out of Babylon, come out of Babylon, come out of Babylon, and come to the truth of Christian identity." Amen.